The samurai legend starts with a sword, but the truth starts with a crack in the armor. A lone warrior, storm-black sky, rain on his helmet, hands near his blade. To most people, this image means one thing: honor. But history is rarely that clean. Behind that polished armor was a different world. Ambition, land, taxes, betrayal, paperwork, women erased from memory, and plenty of warriors who weren't all that noble. The samurai were real, but the version most people know, that one got edited, packaged, romanticized, and sold back to the world like it had always been true. Tonight we are opening the armor. What we find inside is more human, more dangerous, and more interesting than what textbooks usually tell you. The samurai are one of the most recognizable warrior classes in history. Even people who know almost nothing about medieval Japan can picture them. The helmet, the curved sword, the silent stare. In the Western imagination, samurai usually look like Japanese knights. Disciplined, spiritual, elegant, deadly. But that comparison is dangerous, because it makes the samurai sound simple. They weren't simple. They weren't always loyal. They weren't always rich. They weren't always fighting. Stop. Read that again. The word samurai got attached to a warrior class that rose to power in the 12th century and ran Japan until 1868. But the clean image came much later. History gave us warriors. Memory gave us icons. Pop culture gave us the version that now lives everywhere. Here is the strange part. The myth is not completely false. Samurai really did care about loyalty. They really did serve lords. They really did leave behind stories of sacrifice. But the myth becomes false when it pretends that was the whole story. Real samurai lived in a world where survival mattered. A lord could demand loyalty, but another lord could offer land. A warrior could talk about honor, but his family still needed to eat. That is not Hollywood honor. That is history. And history is not written by the person with the cleanest soul. It is written by the person who survived long enough to explain why his side was right. So here is the first secret of the samurai. Their legend was built from real material, but carefully selected material. The elegance was real. The violence was real. But so were fear, hunger, debt, and compromise. Think about a young warrior born into a name he did not choose. His body does not fully belong to him. His sword is status. His death is family reputation. He is not free. He is tied to a lord, a rank, a clan. Textbooks show samurai inside a moral painting, but they lived inside pressure. The armor wasn't just protection, it was a costume of expectation. And the man inside wasn't always a fearless hero. Sometimes he was a servant trying not to get replaced. Sometimes a bureaucrat pretending not to be poor. Sometimes a poet with blood on his hands. Here is where the textbook lies to you next. Ask most people to name the samurai's weapon. They will say the katana, the curved blade. In movies, it flashes in moonlight. In games, it cuts through enemies like silk. But the samurai story did not start with the katana. On real battlefields, arrows mattered, spears mattered, pole arms, fortifications, logistics, and later guns. That detail destroys the clean image of two noble swordsmen meeting in perfect silence. Real war was mud, screams, horses, panic, commanders making decisions from bad information. The katana became an emotional object, tied to rank and identity. But the actual work of war was rarely one guy drawing one sword and settling destiny with a single cut. Think of it this way. The sword was the close-up, but history was the wide shot. And in the wide shot, you see the archers, the foot soldiers, the supply lines, the peasants forced to feed armies, the commanders calculating which side gives them the best future. The samurai weren't just artists of death. They were part of a military machine. That is why you cannot understand the samurai only through the blade. The sword is cinematic, but the real secret is structure. A warrior class does not survive for centuries because every member is brave. It survives because it becomes useful to power. The samurai became land managers, tax collectors, political agents. They move between violence and administration, between the sword and the document. The image of the lone swordsman hides this entire system. This next part shocks people every time. Bushido, the way of the warrior, loyalty, courage, honor, death before disgrace. It sounds ancient. It sounds like every samurai carried the same invisible rulebook inside his heart. But that is not how history works. The neat, universal, spiritual version of Bushido that modern audiences know was shaped much later, especially in modern Japan, when writers reworked the samurai past into a national symbol. That does not mean Bushido is fake. It means Bushido has layers. Some parts connect to older warrior ethics. Some parts got polished in the modern period. Some parts were used for nationalism. So the question is not, did samurai have honor? The better question is, who defined honor, when, and for what purpose? Because a code is never just a code. It tells people how to behave, but it also tells people which stories become sacred and which ones disappear. Here is the uncomfortable twist. The clean moral story was real enough to inspire people, but flexible enough to be used by people who needed obedience. When samurai warfare faded, the code became even more important. Because when the sword no longer decides everything, the warrior has to explain why he still matters. Bushido becomes memory, identity, a way to turn complicated people into moral symbols. And once a symbol is strong enough, people stop asking where it came from. If this story fascinates you, make sure to subscribe and check the playlist. There are more epic battles and hidden histories waiting to be discovered. Now let us talk about loyalty, the heart of the samurai legend. A warrior serves his lord. A retainer protects his master. That is the beautiful version. But loyalty gets harder when your lord is weak, or losing, or cannot protect your family. The samurai lived in a world where loyalty was not just personal morality, it was survival math. A warrior could be loyal and still afraid. A lord could demand absolute devotion and still betray his own followers. That is why the Sengoku age, Japan's Civil War era, matters so much. Power shifted, alliances changed, families rose and fell. And when the ground moves under your feet, loyalty becomes more complicated than any poem can admit. Popular culture gives us the clean tragedy of the faithful warrior who chooses death over compromise. That story is powerful, but the archive of human behavior is wider than that. Some warriors died for their lords, some changed sides, some served the winner. If that sounds less romantic, good. Real history is not a moral poster. It is pressure applied to human beings. What if honor kills your children? What if one quiet betrayal saves your family line? These are not excuses. They are the hard questions history forces us to ask. The samurai were not machines programmed for noble death. They were people inside systems, and systems reward some choices while punishing others. That tension is where the real drama lives. Now here is one of the biggest twists in the entire samurai story. For centuries, the image of the samurai is tied to war. But what happens when large-scale war fades? What happens when the sword remains, but the battlefield disappears? During the Tokugawa period, Japan entered a long era of peace, and the samurai evolved from warriors into an urbanized class of educated bureaucrats. That one sentence breaks the movie version. Suddenly, the warrior is not charging across a battlefield. He is living in a castle town, writing documents, attending ceremonies, managing administrative duties. Imagine being born into a class defined by violence, but living in an age that no longer needs you to fight. Your ancestors won status with weapons. You inherit 2 swords and paperwork. That is psychologically brutal. The samurai become painfully human. They are a class trying to justify itself, trapped inside its own image. This part feels familiar to a modern audience. Different world, same pressure. A person inherits expectations, a job title, a family image. But inside, they may be anxious, underpaid, and terrified of falling behind. The Tokugawa samurai looked powerful from the outside while feeling squeezed from within. That is why the sword stayed so important. Even when not used in battle, it signaled who the samurai was supposed to be. Not just a weapon, a reminder. To others, respect me. To himself, remember what I come from. Every legend has a shadow. The samurai shadow includes the people the legend tried to hide. Women, servants, peasants, the entire social world that made samurai life possible. The samurai class was never just a line of men waiting for sword duels. It was households, marriages, inheritance, political alliances. Women in warrior families could be educated, politically significant, trained in weapons, and central to family survival. But they got flattened by male-centered storytelling. The legend also hides another group, the people beneath the samurai, the peasants who grew the rice, the servants who carried supplies. This is the part that makes the samurai myth uncomfortable, because the same class praised for discipline and beauty also sat at the top of a rigid social order. The samurai were not rebels against hierarchy, they were hierarchy. If you only admire the armor, you miss the system wearing it. So the final secret is not that the samurai were villains. That would be too simple. The final secret is that they were human beings elevated into legend. Some were brave, some were brutal, some were loyal, some were opportunists. They were not one thing. They were a class across centuries, and no class across centuries stays morally pure. That is why the legend became necessary. The myth turns complexity into clarity, a code instead of contradiction, a heroic death instead of political survival. And maybe that is why the samurai still fascinate the world. Not because the myth is true, but because the myth is easier to hold than the truth. The truth makes you look at beauty and violence together, discipline and domination together, honor and ambition together. And when you do that, the samurai become a mirror. They show you how every culture turns power into romance, how every age edits its violence, how every society chooses which warriors to condemn and which ones to turn into legends. So the next time you see a lone samurai beneath a stormy sky, remember, he is not the whole story. Behind him are families, rivals, farmers, debt, blood, and memory. The secret of the samurai is not that they lived only by honor. The secret is that history turned complicated people into legends, and legends are easier to worship than the truth. Thanks for watching. Click subscribe and dive into this playlist next. More untold stories of empires, warriors, and history-changing battles are just a click away.